Picture this scene. A father stands on a mountain in the blazing noon sun. His hands are trembling. His face is wet with tears he has been holding back for 3 days. Laid on a stone altar in front of him is his son, his beloved boy, the one he waited 100 years to hold, the one who filled his tent with laughter, the one every promise from God had been pointing to since the beginning, and in his raised hand, a knife. He is about to do the thing every cell in his body is screaming against. Now I want you to hold that image for a moment, because that mountaintop scene is not where this story starts. It's where it arrives, after 100 years of one of the most extraordinary journeys ever walked by any human being. His name was originally Abram. History would come to know him by a different name, Abraham. Father of the Jewish people, spiritual ancestor claimed by 3 of the world's great religions, a man who left his home for a destination he had never seen. On the word of a God he was still learning to trust. With no map, no army, and no guaranteed outcome. He made mistakes, serious ones. He told a lie that could have destroyed everything. He tried to help God fulfill a promise and created a family crisis that echoed for generations. He doubted. He bargained. He wavered. And yet he is remembered across 4,000 years of human history as the father of faith. How did an ordinary man become that? That is what we are going to find out today. Stay with me, because this story is going to surprise you at almost every turn. To understand Abraham, you have to understand the world he was born into, because it was about as far from monotheism as you can imagine. A great city in ancient Mesopotamia, somewhere in what is now southern Iraq. 4,000 years ago, it was one of the most sophisticated urban centers on Earth. Multi-story homes lined organized streets. Advanced mathematics and astronomy were taught in schools. Courts of law handed down documented rulings. Trade networks stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. But the spiritual life of this remarkable civilization was built on a simple assumption. The universe was controlled by many gods, and those gods demanded constant attention, offering, and appeasement. The easiest way to honor a god was to carve one, shape it from clay, cast it in metal, set it in a shrine, and bring it gifts. Abraham's father, Terah, made his living doing exactly that. His workshop produced the very idols his neighbors bowed before. Every day his calloused hands shaped figures of gods who could not move, speak, see, or hear. And every day, somewhere in the back of his mind, perhaps without even fully acknowledging it, his son Abram was watching and wondering. Here is the question that must have quietly nagged at him. How can something made by human hands be more powerful than the human hands that made it? It's a question that cuts straight through the logic of the entire religious system surrounding him. And there is no clean answer from inside that system. You simply have to go along with it, or step away from it entirely. We don't know exactly how or when God first made contact with Abram. The scriptures pull back the curtain at a very specific moment. But what's clear is that when the voice came, something in Abram already recognized it, not as a stranger, as the answer to a question he had been carrying all his life. Have you ever had a moment, maybe at a crossroads in your life, when something completely unexpected interrupted your ordinary routine and pointed you in a direction you never planned? Something in what happened to Abram resonates with that. He was living a comfortable, established life in Ur. He had a wife, Sarai. He had family, possessions, a community identity, everything that gives a person a sense of rootedness and belonging. And then God spoke. What the voice said was extraordinary in its combination of demand and promise. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household. Go to the land I will show you. No map was provided, no destination named. Just go, and I will show you as we go. The demand alone would have been enough to stop most people cold. Leave everything familiar. Walk into the unknown. Trust a destination that cannot be verified in advance. But the promise that followed was staggering. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name significant. You will be a source of blessing. Those who bless you, I will bless, and those who oppose you, I will deal with. And through you, every family on the face of the earth will be touched by blessing. Now read that carefully. God is not just promising Abram personal success. He is telling one unremarkable man that through him, every human family on earth will eventually benefit. There was one small problem. Abram and Sarai had no children. Sarai was already well past the normal years of childbearing. A great nation from a childless couple is not a logistical challenge. It's an impossibility. But here's what I find remarkable about Abram's response. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for a detailed itinerary. He didn't request a 5-year plan. He packed his things and left. His father, Terah, joined the journey, and so did Abram's nephew, Lot. The whole household moved out of Ur, one of the most sophisticated cities in the ancient world, and walked toward a destination they couldn't name. They stopped in Haran. It was a reasonable place to rest. A prosperous crossroads city about halfway between Ur and the land God had promised to show them. Good water, active trade, familiar enough culture. Terah, Abram's aging father, seemed to settle in comfortably, and perhaps everyone quietly assumed that this was the destination. Perhaps the journey was over, but it wasn't. The text records that Terah lived out his final years in Haran and died there. And then something pivotal happened. The voice came again. Leave. Go to the land I will show you. God doesn't reissue a command unless the first one hasn't been fully followed. Haran was a stopping place, not the destination. Abram's obedience to the original call had been real but partial. It had taken him out of Ur, but not yet to the place God intended. His father's death freed something, some final thread connecting him to the world he had come from. And with Terah buried in Haran, Abram at 75 years of age, Sarai at 65, and his nephew Lot still traveling alongside, the journey resumed. What I find moving about this chapter of the story is the ordinariness of it. God calls. Life interrupts. Years pass in the in-between. The call comes again, and this time, the departure is complete. Most of us recognize that pattern. The moments when we were almost obedient. When we got halfway to where we were supposed to go and found a comfortable compromise. And then the moment when the pause was over and the real journey had to begin. Abram loaded his camels, gathered his people, and headed west into a land called Canaan. When Abram arrived in Canaan, the land was magnificent. Rolling hills covered in wild grasses and ancient olive trees. Clear streams running through fertile valleys. The kind of landscape that stops you mid-stride and makes you breathe differently. There was just one complication. It was full of people. The Canaanites had been there for generations. Their cities were built. Their territories marked. Their social structures firmly in place. Abram was not arriving as a conqueror with an army behind him. He was arriving as a wandering herdsman with a large household, a lot of sheep, and a promise from a God nobody around him had heard of. This is where the first altar appears. At a place called Shechem, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." Abram built an altar there, a simple pile of stones in an occupied land, and worshipped the God who had brought him this far. Think about the faith required for that act. He is standing on land he has been told will belong to his family. He has no children. He has no legal claim. He has no army. The only thing he has is a word from God. He builds the altar anyway. He moved through the land, from Shechem to the hills near Bethel, building altars at each significant stop. These weren't elaborate temples or grand religious monuments. They were markers, reminders. A pilgrim's way of saying, "This is where God met me. This is where I stopped and acknowledged that I could not do this alone." He was learning to live in the tension between the promise and the present reality, between what God said would be and what he could see with his own eyes. That tension, it turns out, would be his companion for the rest of his life. Then the rains stopped. Canaan is not a land that tolerates drought gracefully. Within a season, the grass withered, and streams that had run clean and cold slowed to a trickle, then dried up completely. Abram's flocks were thinning. His servants were worried. His household was looking to him for direction. Word came from travelers on the road. Egypt was unaffected. The Nile flooded every year on schedule. feeding the whole country with unfailing regularity. Egypt had grain. Egypt had water. Egypt was everything Canaan was not in that dry and desperate season. No divine voice gave Abram permission to go, but no voice prohibited it either. He made a practical decision: take the household south to survive the famine. Here's where the story turns complicated, and honestly, a little uncomfortable. As they approached the Egyptian border, a fear took hold of Abram that he apparently couldn't shake. Sarai was a strikingly beautiful woman, and in Egypt, where a foreign woman traveling with a foreign man might be acquired for the palace by simply removing the inconvenient husband, that beauty felt less like a blessing and more like a danger. Abram's solution was a half-truth, wrapped in enough accuracy to feel less like a lie. When the Egyptians ask, "Say you're my sister." Technically, Sarai was his half-sister. Same father, different mothers. So the words weren't false, exactly, but the intent behind them absolutely was. He was protecting himself at her expense. Sure enough, Egyptian officials noticed Sarai's beauty and brought her to Pharaoh's palace. In exchange for what they believed was her brother's goodwill, gifts poured into Abram's camp: livestock, servants, silver, gold. He became wealthy through deception. But God did not let it stand. A series of serious illnesses fell on Pharaoh's household in ways that seemed deliberately targeted. Pharaoh, who was no fool, figured out what had happened. He summoned Abram for a confrontation that must have been deeply humiliating. "What have you done to me? Why did you tell me she was your sister? Why didn't you say she was your wife? Take her and go." The man God had chosen as the father of faith just received a moral dressing down from a pagan ruler. And there is no record of Abram defending himself, because there was no defense to offer. He took Sarai, took everything he'd accumulated, and walked out of Egypt with the stinging weight of a lesson that would need to be learned again. Fear makes us smaller than we are. Deception never builds what it promises to protect. The journey north back to Canaan felt very different from the one that had brought them south. Back in Canaan, Abram returned to the altar near Bethel, the one he had built before the Egypt detour, and called on God's name again. There's something quietly powerful about that. He went back to the place where he had last been right with God, and he started over from there. But prosperity was creating a new problem. Both Abram's household and Lot's household had grown substantially. They had animals, servants, possessions, enough combined wealth that the land couldn't comfortably support both of them in the same territory. Arguments broke out between the herders whose animals would drink first, which pasture belonged to whom, whose claim on a particular grazing area took precedence. Small grievances compounded into regular conflict. The family that had traveled together from Ur was beginning to fracture along the fault lines of success. Abram called Lot to a high ridge and made him an offer that revealed his character at its most generous. "Look as far as you can see in every direction. Choose any region you want. If you go left, I'll go right. If you prefer the right, I'll take the left." Abram was the elder. He had the right of first choice by every cultural norm of the time, and he surrendered it entirely. Lot looked around and made his decision quickly. The Jordan Valley stretched out below them, lush, well-watered, visibly prosperous. Its cities were already established and thriving. It looked, from a distance, like the best piece of real estate available. The city that caught his eye most favorably was Sodom. He didn't know, or didn't want to know, that Sodom's prosperity had been accompanied by a moral collapse so severe that heaven itself had taken notice. He saw what looked good to him on the surface. He made his choice, and he began moving his tent towards Sodom. Abram took what remained, the hill country to the west, and watched his nephew's caravan disappear toward the valley below. Here's what I find striking about this moment. God responded immediately. "Look up, and look in every direction, north, south, east, west. All the land you can see, I will give it to your descendants. As numerous as the dust of the earth, that's how many descendants you will have." Abram surrendered the best land. God extended the promise in every direction. The one who gave away his advantage received an inheritance without limit. Not long after Lot settled near Sodom, war broke out. A coalition of 4 eastern kings swept through the Jordan Valley like a storm. They were experienced, well-armed, and had spent 12 years building their military dominance over the cities of the region. Sodom and its allies had dared to revolt. The response was overwhelming. The battle was over quickly. The eastern kings looted the cities, took captives, and headed north. And among those captives, Lot, his family, his servants, everything he had accumulated since leaving Abram's company. One survivor escaped the massacre and ran to bring Abram the news. What happened next is one of the most unexpectedly dramatic scenes in the entire story. Abram did not hesitate. Family loyalty burned hotter than any practical calculation. He armed his household, 318 men, all trained, all born within his camp, and went after 4 professional armies that had just rolled through an entire region unopposed. By any ordinary military assessment, this was not a wise decision. This was 300 men against forces that had just crushed armies many times their size. But Abram had a strategy. He divided his force into several groups, timed a coordinated night attack on the enemy camp, and struck from multiple directions simultaneously. Confusion and darkness is a weapon all its own. The army that had seemed invincible dissolved in the chaos of a night raid it never anticipated. Lot and his family were recovered. The plunder was retaken. The coalition that had devastated an entire valley retreated before a force 1/10 their size. On the way home, a figure met Abram outside Jerusalem. A man named Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He brought bread and wine, and he blessed Abram. "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Abram gave him 1/10 of everything he had recovered, not as payment for the blessing, as an acknowledgement that the victory had not ultimately been his. It had come from somewhere above. And when the king of Sodom offered him the recovered goods as a reward, Abram refused to take even a sandal strap. "I have sworn to God that I will not take anything from you, not one thread, not one possession, so that no one will ever be able to say that the king of Sodom made Abram wealthy. Whatever he had, he wanted it to come from God alone, not from gratitude, not from political alliance, not from anything anyone could point to and call a human favor. This is the character of the man whose faith is about to be tested far more deeply than any battle. After the battle, after the meeting with Melchizedek, after the refused reward from the king of Sodom, God spoke to Abram again. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward will be very great." And here is where I think the story becomes most deeply human. Abram responds not with gratitude, not with worship, but with a question that has been pressing against his chest for years. "Sovereign Lord, what good are these gifts to me when I still don't have a child? The way things are going, my servant Eliezer will inherit everything I own." He's been waiting. His hair is graying. Sarai's womb has never opened. The promise of descendants like stars seems to mock him every night when he looks at the sky. He knows how biology works. He knows the years are not going in the right direction. He is not rude. He is not faithless. He is just honest with God about the gap between what has been promised and what he can actually see. God's response is one of the most tender invitations in all of Scripture. Come outside. Just that. Come outside. And when Abram stepped out of his tent into the darkness, God said, "Look up at the sky. Count the stars, if you're able to count them. That's how many descendants you will have." Abram looked up. The desert night spread from horizon to horizon, thousands of points of ancient light burning through the absolute dark, each one a life not yet born, each one a promise held in the hands of the one who placed every star exactly where it is. And something happened in him. Abram believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. One of the most important sentences in the entire Bible. No ceremony, no perfect record, no impressive list of religious accomplishments. Just a man looking at the sky, choosing to trust the one who made it, and being credited as right with God on that basis alone. Then Abram did something that reveals how honest his faith really was. He asked for confirmation. How can I know for certain that I will possess this land? God answered with a ceremony that the ancient world would have immediately understood. A covenant cut in blood, sealed by fire, in which God alone walked the path between the divided animal halves. In every other ancient covenant-making ceremony, both parties walked that path together. Both carried the risk. If either one failed to honor the terms, the implication was clear. May what happened to these animals happen to me. But in this ceremony, only God moved. A smoking firepot and a blazing torch, symbols of divine presence, passed between the pieces in the darkness, while Abram lay in a deep sleep. God was saying something staggering. This covenant rests entirely on me. If it fails, the consequences fall on me alone. The Almighty staked himself on keeping his word to one man. 10 years passed after the covenant ceremony, and Sarai's womb remained closed. Now I want you to think about what 10 years of unanswered prayer feels like. 10 years of hoping every month, and every month the same answer. 10 years of watching other women in the neighboring camps nurse their babies and scold their toddlers and tuck their children in at night. 10 years of carrying a promise that seemed to be running out of time. Sarai had a plan. Ancient custom, and she knew it well, offered a recognized workaround for barrenness. A wife could give her personal servant to her husband as a surrogate. Any children born would legally belong to the wife. It was culturally accepted, even expected in some circles. Her servant Hagar was Egyptian, young, healthy, capable. Sarai brought the plan to Abram with the exhausted practicality of someone who has given up waiting for the other solution. God has kept me from having children. Take my servant. Perhaps through her, I'll have a family. Abram agreed. And this is the point in the story where I find myself wanting to ask, where was the consultation with God in that decision? The voice had spoken to him before. He knew what it sounded like, but there's no record of him asking whether this was the right time or the right path. He simply agreed. Hagar became pregnant almost immediately, and almost immediately, things went sideways. Pregnancy shifted something in Hagar's perspective toward the mistress who had given her to Abram. Sarai felt it, the barely concealed contempt of a fertile woman toward a barren one. The power dynamic had shifted in the most intimate possible way. Sarai's pain boiled over into blame directed at Abram, who responded by essentially saying, "She's your servant. Deal with it as you see fit." Sarai dealt with it harshly. Hagar fled into the desert, pregnant, alone, without provisions, heading in the general direction of Egypt. And here's the moment in this story that stops me every time. An angel of God found Hagar at a desert spring, not Abram. Not Sarai, the servant girl, who had no say in any of this, who had been used as a means to solve someone else's problem, who was carrying a child she hadn't planned. God showed up for her. The angel gave her a promise her son would be born, would be named Ishmael, and would become the father of a great people. And Hagar gave God a name that no one had ever used before. You are the God who sees me, El Roy. The God who notices the overlooked, the one who shows up for the people everyone else has written off. She went back. Ishmael was born. And for 13 years, he was Abram's only son, loved, cherished, the apparent heir to everything. But the promise was not finished yet. 13 years of silence from heaven. Then, when Abram was 99 years old, when any remaining biological possibility seemed to have definitively closed, God appeared again. I am God Almighty. Walk before me. Be blameless. I will establish my covenant between us and multiply you greatly. What followed was a moment of identity transformation. Your name will no longer be Abram. Your name will be Abraham, because I am making you the father of many nations. Abram means exalted father. Abraham means father of multitudes. He had been walking around for decades with a name that described a future he hadn't lived into yet. And now God was pressing it deeper into his very identity. And then Sarai's name was changed too. As for Sarai, she will no longer be called Sarai. Her name is Sarah. I will bless her, and she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." At this, Abraham fell on his face and laughed, not the laughter of mocking. The scripture suggests something closer to stunned, overwhelmed disbelief, because the math was simply impossible. 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman, a child. And in that moment, thinking perhaps of his beloved Ishmael, the son he had loved for 13 years, Abraham voiced the prayer of a father who loved what he already had. If only Ishmael could live under your blessing. God's answer was gracious and clear yes. Ishmael will be blessed. 12 princes will come from him. He will become a great nation. But the covenant promise will carry through the child Sarah will bear within the year. You will name him Isaac. The word means laughter. The impossible promise would arrive wearing the name of the laugh it provoked. And God gave the covenant a sign. Circumcision, a physical mark to be carried in the bodies of Abraham's descendants as a permanent reminder of this promise. That same night, Abraham circumcised every male in his household. Complete, immediate obedience. No delay. No discussion. The afternoon heat was at its most punishing. Abraham sat at the entrance of his tent in the shade, probably resting through the hottest part of the day, when he looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. He didn't know who they were. He couldn't have, but his response was immediate and full. He ran to greet them, bowed low, and began organizing his household to provide them with the best hospitality he had to offer. Water for their feet, shade to rest in, fresh bread from the best flour, a choice calf from his best livestock, curds and milk alongside. He stood near them while they ate, the posture of a host, fully attentive to his guests. Then one of the visitors asked a question. "Where's your wife Sarah?" "There, in the tent," Abraham said. "I will return to you next spring," the visitor said, with a certainty that belongs to no ordinary traveler. "And by then, Sarah will have a son." Sarah was standing just inside the tent entrance, listening, and she laughed to herself quietly. She was past 90. Her husband was nearly 100. The very idea was, why did Sarah laugh? The voice came from outside the tent, and the question stopped her cold. She hadn't laughed aloud. She hadn't said anything, yet the visitor knew. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? At the appointed time, a year from now, Sarah will have a son. Sarah denied that she had laughed. She was afraid now. "No," came the quiet reply. "You did laugh." Sarah would think about that conversation for the rest of her life, about the visitor who knew what she had thought, about the word appointed time, as if this had always been scheduled. And the only thing that had been waiting was the right moment on a calendar written long before any of them were born. After the meal, the visitors rose and looked toward the south, toward Sodom, where Lot still lived with his family. And God, for Abraham, had realized by now, who was standing with him, shared what was coming. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is severe. What is happening there is very serious. I am going down to see it. 2 of the visitors continued toward Sodom, but the Lord stayed with Abraham for a moment longer, and Abraham did something remarkable. He began to negotiate. Suppose there are 50 righteous people in the city. Will you really sweep it away and not spare it for the sake of the 50 righteous there? God agreed. For 50, the city would be spared. Then Abraham, and you can almost see him building his nerve, pressed further. What about 45? What about 40? 30? 20? What if there are only 10? God agreed to each new number, even 10. For 10 righteous people, the entire city would be spared. I find this conversation one of the most remarkable in all of Scripture. Abraham is not doubting God's power. He's not even questioning God's justice. He's interceding, throwing himself between divine judgment and human beings who hadn't even asked him to. He's standing in the gap for people who may not have deserved it, and God let him do it. He engaged every question, lowered the threshold every time, and honored Abraham's intercession at each step. This is not a God who resents being questioned. This is a God who welcomes it. Abraham walked away from that conversation, having pressed God to the limit of his courage. 10 righteous people. Surely Lot's family alone would meet that number. That night, 2 angels arrived at Sodom's gate. Lot saw them and immediately offered his home. Something in him recognized that these travelers needed protection, because in Sodom, unprotected strangers were not safe. The events of that night confirmed everything God had already said about the city. Its moral corruption wasn't hidden beneath some veneer of respectability. It was right at the surface, brazen, organized, and completely without shame. The angels told Lot what was coming. He went to warn his future sons-in-law, the men engaged to his daughters. They thought he was joking. Even within his own family, Lot's voice carried no moral authority. He had been too long in Sodom's company for anyone to take his warning seriously. At dawn, the angels physically pulled Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters out of the city. The text says they hesitated, and the angels grabbed their hands and led them out by force. The destruction, when it came, was absolute. Fire from the sky consumed both cities. Everyone who remained was gone. Lot's wife looked back. We don't know why. Whether it was curiosity, or grief for a life left behind, or something she simply couldn't let go of. The text doesn't explain it. It just records what happened. She looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Abraham, watching from the heights where he had stood with God the night before, saw the smoke rising from the plain like a furnace. Lot survived, but barely. And with nothing. The wealth he had chosen Sodom for, the prosperity he had seen shining from a distance, all of it gone in a single morning. The story doesn't judge Lot harshly. It's not that kind of narrative, but it does let the consequences speak for themselves. What you move toward, you become shaped by. What you choose to live near, you eventually live inside. And Sodom was never just a city on a map. Abraham moved his household south toward the Negev desert and settled for a time in a region ruled by a king named Abimelech. And then, almost unbelievably, he did it again. He introduced Sarah as his sister. Now Sarah was roughly 90 years old. By any ordinary standard, the beauty that had caught Pharaoh's attention in Egypt years earlier might have seemed a less pressing concern. But whatever the reason, Abraham told the same half-truth to Abimelech's court, and Sarah was taken into the king's household. God intervened again, this time by appearing to Abimelech in a dream and making the situation absolutely clear. The king, though an outsider, responded with more moral clarity than the patriarch who had caused the crisis. "I did this with an entirely clear conscience," Abimelech told God. "I had no idea she was his wife." God confirmed that he knew this, and that he had already prevented any harm from coming to pass. When Abraham was called before the king to account for what he had done, his explanation revealed the fear that had driven the decision. "I thought, there is no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." He had made the same assumption about Abimelech that he had made about Pharaoh, and he had been wrong both times. Abimelech, by every observable standard, was a man of honor. Abraham had misjudged the situation. And worse, he had endangered Sarah to protect himself. Twice. What strikes me about this repeated failure is that God didn't disqualify him. The divine patience with Abraham's persistent tendency to protect himself at Sarah's expense is remarkable. Not approving, but patient and still working. The covenant was not contingent on Abraham's perfection, because if it were, it would have ended a very long time ago. The Lord visited Sarah, just as he had said. That is how the scripture records the moment. No elaborate explanation, no theological commentary. Just the simple, stunning fact, what God said would happen, happened. Sarah conceived. Abraham was 100 years old when his son was born. Sarah was 90, and they named the boy exactly as God had instructed, Isaac. Laughter. Sarah said something at the birth that is rung down through 40 centuries. God has brought me laughter. Everyone who hears this will laugh with me. What was once the involuntary laugh of overwhelming disbelief, the laugh she tried to hide when the angel told her she'd be pregnant in a year, had become pure joy. The same word, completely transformed. This is what the fulfilled promise looks like. Not the straining, effortful achievement of something you produced through your own determination, but a gift that arrives when the moment is right, in a way that makes you laugh because there is nothing else adequate to do. Abraham held his son and probably didn't say much at all. Sometimes joy is too large for words. You just hold it. Isaac grew. He was weaned, a major occasion in the ancient world, celebrated with a feast. And it was at that feast that something happened between Ishmael and young Isaac that Sarah noticed and responded to with iron determination. She came to Abraham with a demand. Hagar and Ishmael had to go. It broke Abraham's heart. Ishmael was his son too. Loved, known, raised for 17 years. The thought of sending him away was unbearable. But God spoke. Listen to Sarah. It is through Isaac that your offspring will be counted. And for Ishmael I will also make a nation, because he is your son. Abraham rose early the next morning. He gave Hagar supplies for the road. He sent her away. We don't read about the night before, but we can imagine it. Hagar wandered into the wilderness with her son and whatever provisions Abraham had packed. When the water ran out, she placed Ishmael beneath a desert shrub, the only shade she could find, and walked far enough away that she couldn't see his face. She couldn't bear to watch him die. She sat down and she wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, even from where he lay under that shrub, even without words. An angel called to Hagar from heaven. What's the matter? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy's voice. Lift him up. Take him by the hand. I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well of water nearby. Water had been there all along. She simply hadn't been able to see it. There are moments, if you've lived long enough, you've probably experienced at least one, when you are in a desperate, dry place, and the thing you need was actually present, just beyond your current ability to see it. Sometimes what we need is not for God to provide something new. We need our eyes opened to what's already there. God was with the boy as he grew up. Ishmael became a skilled archer in the wilderness of Haran. His mother found him a wife from Egypt. He became the father of 12 princes, the ancestors of the Arabic peoples. The son who was sent away was never out of God's sight. Now we arrive at the chapter that begins this story. The knife on the mountain. Isaac had grown into a young man. The camp was settled. Peace had come to Abraham's household after the turbulence of the years before. He was finally living in the quiet joy of watching his son become the person God had promised he would be. Then the voice came again. In the night, Abraham, here I am. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Go to the region of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. The words must have felt like the bottom falling out of everything. Isaac was not just his son. Isaac was the covenant. Every promise God had made passed through this boy. Remove Isaac, and there are no descendants like stars. There is no great nation. There is no blessing flowing to every family on earth. If Abraham obeyed this command, he would be destroying the very thing God had spent a century building. And yet he rose before dawn. He didn't argue. He didn't bargain. He had tried doing things his own way before Egypt, Hagar, Abimelech, and the results had always been worse than if he had simply trusted. This time, he would trust. He saddled his donkey, cut wood for the offering, took 2 servants and his son, and began the 3-day journey to Moriah. The 3 days were their own particular torture. Every sunrise, every meal, every moment Isaac walked beside him, talking freely and easily, asking questions, laughing at something. Every hour pressed the weight down harder. On the 3rd morning, he saw the mountain. He left the servants at the base with a statement that has puzzled and moved people for thousands of years. The boy and I will go up there and worship, and then we will come back to you. We will come back, both of us. Did he believe that? Was he simply protecting the servants from a truth too heavy to share? Or had something begun to form in the depths of his faith, some impossible, barely whispered belief that God could not simply unmake what God had made? The letter to the Hebrews, written centuries later, says exactly that. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. He had seen God do the impossible before, in his own body. in Sarah's body was resurrection beyond the same God who had created a child from two people who were biologically finished. He picked up the wood and laid it on Isaac's shoulders. He carried the fire and the knife. Father and son began the final ascent. Partway up the mountain, Isaac spoke. "Father, yes, my son, I see the fire and the wood. But where is the lamb for the offering?" Abraham stopped walking. He turned and looked at his son's face. Open, curious, entirely trusting. "God himself will provide the lamb, my son." He said it, and he believed it, even as he could not see how it was possible. Even as every step forward on that path seemed to be taking him further from any version of it being true. They reached the summit. Abraham built the altar, arranged the wood. Then he turned to Isaac. What was said between them in that moment, we are not told. But Isaac did not run. He allowed himself to be bound and laid on the altar. His trust in his father and his father's God held even in that terrifying moment. Abraham raised the knife, and the angel's voice broke through everything. "Abraham! Abraham, here I am. Do not lay your hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up. There, caught by its horns in a nearby thicket, was a ram. God had provided, exactly as he had said he would. At the very last possible moment, on a mountain called Moriah, the Lord himself supplied what the moment required. Abraham named the place Yahweh Yireh. The Lord will provide. Or literally, the Lord will see to it. It has been seen to ever since. Abraham and Isaac descended that mountain as different men. They had entered together. They came down bound together by something that went far deeper than blood. The experience of having faced the absolute worst and discovered that God was there on the other side of it. They returned to Beersheba, to Sarah, to the rhythms of their household. Several years later, Abraham received word that his brother Nahor's family had grown and flourished far away in Haran. He filed that information quietly in his heart. Someday, Isaac would need a wife. But before that day came, Sarah died. 127 years of life, and in Abraham's telling of it through his grief, through the tears he shed for the woman who had traveled every mile of this impossible journey beside him. She was everything. He went to the Hittite leaders in the region around Hebron and made a request that revealed exactly how he saw his own position in this land after all these decades. "I am a foreigner and a stranger among you. Sell me some property, a burial site, so I can bury my dead." A foreigner. After all the promises about the land, after decades of walking it, building altars on it, grazing his flocks across it, he still held it loosely, still acknowledged that he was there as a guest in a land that would belong to his descendants, not yet to him. He purchased the cave of Machpelah, paying full market price, refusing a gift, insisting on legal ownership witnessed publicly at the city gate. He buried Sarah there, with the dignity she deserved. The first piece of Canaan that legally belonged to Abraham was a burial cave. Before the land, the ground, the promise carried forward not in conquest, but in grief and faith. Abraham called his most trusted servant and gave him the mission that would shape the next generation of the story. "I want you to swear by the God of heaven and earth that you will not find a wife for Isaac from among the Canaanite women. Go back to my homeland, to my extended family in Haran. Find a wife for my son there." The servant asked a practical question. "What if she won't come? Should I take Isaac back to your homeland?" Abraham's answer reveals a faith refined by 100 years of experience. "No. God will send his angel ahead of you and make your mission successful. And if the woman is unwilling to come, then you are released from your oath. But Isaac must not go back. No backward steps. The promise was always forward, always into the unknown land, not back to the familiar one." The servant took 10 camels loaded with gifts and set out. When he arrived at the city of Nahor in the evening, he stopped at the community well outside the city walls. Women were coming out to draw water for their households, and he prayed one of the most specific, faith-filled prayers in the entire story. "Lord, God of my master Abraham, Show kindness to him today. Here I am, at this well. The women of the city are coming to draw water. Let it be that the girl I ask for a drink, the one who says, 'Drink, and I'll also water your camels,' let her be the one you have chosen for your servant Isaac." Before he had even finished the prayer, a young woman arrived at the well. She was beautiful and strong. Her name was Rebekah. She was the granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor. The servant asked for a drink. She gave him water and then immediately offered, "I'll also draw water for your camels until they've all had enough to drink." She filled the trough and kept drawing until all 10 camels were satisfied. 10 thirsty camels, after a long journey, require an extraordinary amount of water. This was not a polite gesture. This was sustained, effortful generosity. The servant watched in silence, wondering whether this was the sign he had asked for. When she was finished, he gave her gifts of gold and asked whose daughter she was. And when she named her family and offered hospitality at her father's house, he bowed his head and worshipped right there at the well. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master." Rebekah ran home to tell her family what had happened. Her brother Laban came running out to the well, and the servant repeated everything to the assembled family. The original promise to Abraham, the mission he had been sent on, the prayer at the well, the immediate answer. When he finished, the family's response was direct. "This is clearly from the Lord. We cannot say one way or the other. Here is Rebekah. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has indicated." They called Rebekah and asked her directly, "Will you go with this man?" "I will go," she said. Isaac had gone out to the fields in the evening to walk, to think, perhaps to pray, when he looked up and saw the camel caravan approaching in the distance. Rebekah looked up and saw a man walking toward them across the open field. "Who is that man?" she asked. "That is my master," the servant said. She covered her face with her veil, the traditional gesture of a bride upon meeting the man she would marry. And the servant told Isaac everything that had happened. The story records what followed in the most economical sentence imaginable. Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. He married Rebekah. He loved her. And he was comforted after his mother's death. A tent that had been empty, a grief that had sat heavy and unmoving. And into both of them, a young woman from Haran, who had said yes to a journey she couldn't have fully imagined when she agreed to it, because her grandmother-in-law she was replacing had walked that kind of road first. Abraham had one more chapter. He married again a woman named Keturah and had 6 more sons. He lived to 175 years, and when he died, the 2 sons he had lived with the most complicated relationship came together and buried him, Isaac and Ishmael, together at the cave of Machpelah, beside Sarah. Let me ask you something before we close. What do you think made Abraham the father of faith? Not his flawless performance, not his perfect obedience, not his unshakable confidence, or his complete freedom from fear or doubt. He lied. Twice. He tried to help God fulfill a promise through his own planning, and created a family fracture that echoes to this day. He laughed at the impossible promise, and then God named the promise laughter. He questioned, bargained, wavered, and waited, and he kept going. Through Haran, through Egypt, through the separation from Lot, through 13 years of silence between covenants, through the expulsion of Ishmael, through the knife above his son on the mountain of Moriah. He kept going. And at the end of it, he was called the friend of God, not the perfect servant, the friend. The one God confided in about what he was about to do, the one God negotiated with over the fate of a city, the one God credited as righteous, not because of his record, but because of his trust. Here's what I think the story of Abraham is actually about. It's about what God can do with an ordinary person who simply refuses to give up on the promise, who keeps rebuilding the altar after every detour, who goes back to Bethel after Egypt, who climbs the mountain even when he doesn't understand what is waiting at the top, who buries his wife in the land of promise, knowing the land isn't his yet, knowing it will be. 4,000 years later, 3 major world religions trace some part of their spiritual lineage to this man. Billions of people descended from, or connected to the promise given to one childless, questioning, imperfect, completely ordinary person who looked at the night sky and chose to believe. The stars Abraham counted on that desert night are the same stars you can see tonight if your sky is clear enough. They haven't moved. Neither has the promise. If you know someone who needs to hear that God hasn't forgotten them, that the silence between promises is not the same as the end of the promise, share this with them. Leave a comment and tell me which moment in Abraham's story resonated with you most. Was it the knife on the mountain? The laugh Sarah couldn't suppress? The well God opened in the desert when Hagar couldn't see it? Whatever it was, I'd love to hear. Because faith like this is still possible, even now, even for us. God bless you. I'll see you in the next story.